Hey everyone, this DSA leader has a model the United States could learn from.
Is there a model for a politics or a society that is real and existing in this world that you would like to see the United States copy or somehow be close to?
I wish that more socialist experiments could be happening without CIA interference, without U.S. Sanctions messing with the. But I wish that we weren't doing, spending billions of dollars to destabilize Cuba. I think there are lessons we can take from different socialist projects. I think the Cuban Family Code is a really interesting one in participatory democracy and the way that they changed their constitution to make it more egalitarian.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Megan Romer, a DSA co-chair. She's been on a bit of a media tour lately. You might have seen her on Fox News Sunday a couple weeks ago. Here she was on with the New Yorker editor-in-chief David Remnick discussing Cuba. I think this is so important to underline because the DSA wants to portray itself as democratic. That's why they have democratic in their name. And they'll often say, oh, just what we want is something like Norway has or Sweden, kind of benign, more socialistic policies. Who can oppose that? Now they distort what Sweden's like. Sweden is much more capitalist than portrayed, but let's put that aside. The thing is, when Cuba comes up, they obviously have a sympathy with a communist dictatorship. They apologize for it. They make excuses for it. They celebrate aspects of it, and they are not willing to denounce a dictatorship as a dictatorship. Very easy for me to do, very easy for most Democrats to do, but they can't do it. Romer was on with one of her colleagues, with Jorge Ramos on his podcast. Here's a clip from that.
What's your relationship with these countries? Do you believe that Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, that they are dictatorships?
For us, expanding democracy, the small d democratic part of democratic socialism is core to what we stand for and what our vision for the world. We want to expand democracy in the electoral system. We want to expand democracy in our workplaces through labor unions and in our communities. So that's a core part of what we're doing. That's what we're also very aware of our responsibility within the United States to influence U.S. policy. So when we're thinking about other countries, we want to expand democracy everywhere.
Is Cuba a dictatorship for you?
I think in the United States, it's hard for us to judge other countries being dictatorships when we have Donald Trump as president, when basic voting rights are under attack in the U.S., validated by the Supreme Court just a few months ago. I think we have a lot of work to do in the United States to make sure we have a democracy.
Let me go back to Cuba. Do you think Cuba is a dictatorship?
But there are things that the Cuban people themselves would want to change in their own system, but it's hard to do that when the blockade is such a severe. It's strangling their economy.
Now, these DSA types do this so often. A foreign country comes up, a problem with a foreign country comes up, and what do? They bring it back to the United States and blame the United States or make a criticism of the United States. Now, look, you don't have to like Donald Trump, as I've said repeatedly in these videos, but he's not a dictator. You're not living in a dictatorship. And the fact that you don't like Donald Trump doesn't really tell us anything relevant about Cuba and the authoritarianism of its political system. But he won't give it up. He won't admit the nature of the Castroite regime, and also blames America in another way by saying it's all about the blockade. That is a key theme. Also, with DSA types making excuses for Cuba. Come back to that, I think, in a couple minutes and delve into that in more detail. Meantime, Romer jumped in this aspect of the conversation.
I can jump in. So I've been to Cuba 3 times. I was not talking to people who were like big advocates of the Cuban government. But they did say the issue is the blockade. The issue is the blockade. Get rid of the blockade. We'll figure it out from there. And that was, just to a person, that was the thing that people were saying. And I take that to heart.
So there we go again. She's talking about the embargo or the blockade. Certainly true. The U.S. has had an embargo on Cuba for decades now. President Trump has tightened it up recently, but this is not the fundamental cause of the economic distress of Cuba. Cuba over the years, by the way, has gotten pretty proficient at evading the embargo, and the embargo doesn't stop it from trading with all sorts of other countries around the world. The fundamental problem is that Cuba has an economic model that doesn't work fundamentally. It's the DSA model, basically, by the way, but there is no country that has adopted this command and control type policies and had economic success, whether the US has had an embargo or not, like them or not. This just doesn't work. And then there's the idea that she says, well, we just lift the embargo and then the Cubans can figure it out. No, the Cubans can't figure it out, because this is a government that has ruled by the barrel of a gun, or from the barrel of a gun, since the Castroite revolution in the late 1950s. If people want to figure it out themselves and go and protest in the streets, they'll be beaten up, they'll be jailed, they'll be tortured. And this is something that the Cuban government, the communist government of Cuba, is doing, and that they can't admit. Here's yet more from Romer.
Do you believe that Cuba is a dictatorship, Megan?
I believe that Cubans have access to their democracy in a way that we do not. For example, I think the Families Code was just sort of an incredible demonstration of popular democracy. And also, no, they don't have multi-party elections, which is a real problem. I also think we don't have access to our constitution in ways that are really problematic. We're on like 50 years of the ERA not being passed. 50 years. It's been since the 70s.
All right, so she included there what we call in print journalism a to be sure line. That's kind of caveat to cover yourself on something, a point you feel as though you have to concede even though you don't really want to. So she says, yeah, it's not great that they don't have a multi-party democracy. Then she goes on in the typical MO to bash the United States strangely and randomly over the lack of an equal rights amendment in the U.S. Constitution. This was a matter that was debated extensively and democratically in the United States for years, and we declined to change the Constitution and adopt this amendment. But I assure you, women in the United States have equal rights, even though there isn't an equal rights amendment in the Constitution. Then she goes to this family code. This is something she mentioned in the clip with Remick at the top. This refers to a 2022 referendum in Cuba that adopted same-sex marriage, liberalized rules around marriage, adoption, and the like. And this does seem to have been a relatively free vote, certainly by Cuban standards, passed by a 60-40 margin. But to hold this up as a great example of participatory democracy and pass over the fact that Cubans can't select, have no voice in the selection of their own presidents. No one ever voted for Fidel. No one voted for Raul. No one voted for the current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, right? This is the crux of the matter, and she doesn't want to grapple with it. And by the way, at the same time that referendum was passing in 2022, the Cuban government was arresting artists and dissidents who were advocating for liberty on the island, the same way the government has since its inception in the late 1950s. Now, Romer's colleague was also asked about Cuba in another interview on CNN. In this case, the anchor of Cuban heritage. He tells the story of his grandfather in Cuba and gets at this issue in a more personal and pungent way. Take a look.
I'll give you a personal example. My grandfather was a revolutionary in Cuba during that time. He was affected by a previous dictator, Fulgencio Batista, having his friends disappeared in the street for speaking their minds. My grandfather found that revolution hoping to bring democracy to Cuba. And then what happened? Fidel Castro locked my grandfather up, sentenced to 20 years for doing what you're doing now on live TV, for speaking his mind, for expressing himself freely, for trying to organize politically. So I wonder, again, how you think that lands with people who suffered under that dictatorship, who now you are trying to court as voters when your organization comes out and lauds 100 years of Castro. I don't think it would land well with them, Ashik.
We're seeing many people in the United States who are seeing who are struggling under massive inequality in the United States.
Now, there's a very notable hesitation or pregnant pause there. I don't know, maybe his satellite link had a delay, but then we hear him going to the same sort of thing we've heard throughout this video, evasions and criticisms of the United States. At the end of the day, the DSA just likes Castroism. They put out this statement on the 100th anniversary of Fidel Castro's birth. Today is the centenary of Fidel Castro, and the Democratic Socialists of America recognize the historic significance of both the day and the man. Fidel was an organizer, a fighter, and endures as a stalwart symbol of anti-imperialist struggle and self-determination for the global South. DSA has a long history of solidarity with the Cuban people, their revolution, and their self-determination. So to celebrate the self-determination of the Cuban people is a sick joke. The whole point of the dictatorship is to keep the Cuban people from determining their own fate. And by the way, the elite in Cuba is incredibly corrupt and has enriched itself for decades at the expense of the Cuban people. It turns out the DSA is in favor of wealthy landowners so long as they are corrupt communist dictators. And by the way, the other stories we hear about how wonderful the Castroite dictatorship is because there's been a big literacy program at the outset, or the healthcare is great. These are all myths as well. I wrote about this a couple years ago. It's not true that Cuba was markedly illiterate prior to the advent of the Castro dictatorship in 1960. The literacy rate was about 80%, high by the standards of the time. Nor is it correct that Castro had benevolent intentions with his literary campaign. The point was to make it easier to stuff the Cuban people with communist propaganda. It has proven entirely possible, by the way, for other Latin American countries to achieve steep increases in literacy without running gulags. What about advances in healthcare and on other metrics? The economic historian Brad DeLong has noted that in 1957, Cuba had lower infant mortality than many European countries, more doctors and nurses per capita than Britain or Finland, and as many vehicles per capita as Italy or Portugal. After decades of misrule, its per capita GDP ranks with Mongolia's and Bhutan's, according to CIA figures. This suggests correctly that Castro took over a country in pretty good shape and wrecked it, rather than the other way around. Now, if they're all in favor of Swedish-style social democracy, they could spend a lot of time praising Sweden. They could contrast, by the way, the Swedish model, this Nordic social democracy, high levels of social trust and technologically advanced society and all the rest of it, with this terrible Caribbean dictatorship, and say they're all in favor of the latter, the Nordic model, and they reject this dictatorship. But that's not what they do. They are driven by hatred of the United States, by profound belief that the United States is responsible for all the world's ill, and at the end of the day, a basic sympathy with the Castroite project to shill for one of the worst, most ruinous dictatorships on the planet. And that really tells you all you need to know. By the way, love to hear from you. Comment, like, or subscribe. Promise you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry. Over and out.